じゃあ宿題だな。なぜ命が大事なのか。
That is the one question that these characters, more than any others, likely have to ask themselves a lot. I know I've said this before, but I really do think it bears repeating. I think Toei has the greatest lineup of heroes and heroines. I think a major reason for this is because they remain the most timeless of characters who often exposit some of the most basic and yet also most important tenets of what true heroism is to the widest of audiences. This is especially the case for the leads of each of these series, be it the Green Riders, even though we haven't had a green one recently, or the Red Sentai, oh wait, or the Precure's, Thank you, Surihime. That clip always helps. So yeah, the varying leads are meant to be the best representations of the morals and ideals of their respective series. Granted, that doesn't always end up being the case, but still, it's because of these characters that Toei has maintained 3 strong franchises. This has been supported by the fact that they do cover a lot of different audiences and themes. In the end, these franchises do try to get across different messages, as for the most part, they do cater to different audiences, hence why certain leads wouldn't exactly appeal to others. Not unless you're a freak who collects everything. Thus, for this video essay, I want to show my appreciation for these characters by first figuring out what are some of the key tenets of each of these franchises, like what are some of the dominant messages that they try to get across to what sort of audiences. Obviously, there are a lot of variances even within their respective franchises themselves, but I think there are also some underlying threads to them as well. From there, I'll try to pick out who I think are currently the best ambassadors for each. Though I'll say right now, I think Hongo put it best when he asked that question, but let's put the philosophy aside for now and just get right into things. Just like the first Toei Trinity video, we'll go in chronological order from when these franchises originally started, though in this case, it's more to highlight the changing audiences. For better and for worse, things are a lot different than they were in the days of our parents or even grandparents. Thus, trying to say the difference between the audiences of Sentai/Kamen Rider and Precure are boys versus girls isn't exactly the case. In fact, there's a little more nuance to it. These heroes do adjust with the eras and trends, though not too much that it becomes their main identifiers. Thus, for the most part, they remain timeless and didn't become like, say...
X-Men is supposed to be something that is important to the now, and so what is more now than Zoomers?
You know, maybe the real reason Toei has the best heroes is because they don't have much competition. With that, we'll once again go back to 1970 with the original Kamen Rider. Oh, sorry, I think I got my characters mixed up. You know what? Let's actually talk about this dude a little bit, as he is kind of the figurative and literal skeleton to all of this. This is Skullman, and no, not that one. He was a creation of Shotaro Ishinomori for a one-shot manga that was released just 1 year before Kamen Rider's very first episode in 1971. It's a fine read that I do recommend checking out, even if the ending is a little sudden and pretty exposition heavy since it was a one-shot. That said, the influences this manga has had on Kamen Rider are pretty apparent. Obviously, the character's helmet became the basis for the riders, though it would be given more of a grasshopper motif by the suggestion of Ishinomori's son. Skull-esque riders would still appear in the franchise, including one of my favorite movie riders of all time. However, some slightly more subtle carryovers were some of the themes and ideas from this manga that even kind of influenced the rest of the Trinity. Now, Skullman himself was probably one of the most anti-heroes. Let's just say the skull motif isn't the only thing he shares with a certain Marvel superhero. Hell, I'm not even sure if Castle would approve of half the stuff he did. To put it simply, his motivations were a little tinfoil hatty. In some of the last few pages of the one-shot, Skullman, and I think by extension Ishinomori himself, aired a lot of his grievances about Japan's social-political climate at the time. And while I doubt Ishinomori totally believed in all of these extremist views, as he also wrote in a character who immediately shot down Skullman's insane views, there was still very much a strong sense of anti-authority throughout this one-shot. Though to be fair, that feeling likely wasn't at all exclusive to mangaka like him, or even his mentor Osamu Tezuka, who actually wrote a whole book about authority figures literally being stubborn old dogs. I think Japan was still being rocked by the war and never truly did forgive their government for it. Thankfully, Toei did convince him to tone it down significantly for their show. According to the man himself, Kamen Rider Shin was closer to his original ideas for the series, which, yeah, I'm not sure if that would have gone over well with the young boy audience. I bring up these themes because they still do seem to influence Kamen Rider, and even Precure to a degree, that, and even if Skullman's actions were morally wrong, he did demonstrate one key aspect of the Toei hero: an undying resolve. Though before we get more into that, let's go back to talking about Kamen Rider's audience, as it does significantly play into the framework of what sort of heroes these guys are. As I've said, when this franchise originally came out, it was the 70s, the time of bullets, as well as a still recovering economy following Japan's losses in the war. For many men, it felt like they were being pressured into becoming another cog in the big businesses, even if it meant surrendering their individuality and becoming something they're not. This is what the big evil organization the Showa-era riders fought against, Shocker, kind of became an allegory for. Well, that and the, Sweets Police from Kira Kira. Yeah, that's what they're influenced from, and nothing else that might get me in trouble with this website. But yeah, with that in mind, while it was trying to appeal to a young boys audience, it also ended up connecting with the guys around the riders' ages who also had just entered into the workforce. For reference, Hiroshi Fujioka was in his late 20s when he first donned the spandex.
That is not spandex!
As a result, it was teaching the young boys lessons on how to survive into adulthood, which, to be fair, had to be pretty damn scary in the still relatively post-war era of Japan. Thus, alongside the standard superhero messages of just being a good person, which we'll talk more about in just a bit, the show writers also often promoted a strong message about finding independence. As while they would often work together and even end their eras with big team-ups, by their nature, writers were the lone wolf types who just wanted to find their place in the world, not unlike many Japanese citizens back then. Another interesting underlying theme was the fact that they often ended up using the same powers they got from Shocker and their affiliates. This could kind of be seen as them working within their broken systems to bring about change. Now, all of those are great motivations for becoming a hero and everything, but at the same time, yeah, they are slightly outdated mindsets. I mean, again, it was understandable considering the country was transitioning out of its worst of times, but just trying to be the rebel without a cause wasn't going to get you far in life. Now, the show writers would still form an important basis for what was to come for future leads of the franchise, but yeah, in order to truly get a grasp on these guys, we need to consider all of the eras, so let's just head right into Heisei and Reiwa next. After spending the 90s off the air due to declining ratings and toy sales, Kamen Rider came back with some literal facelifts with the average age of our heroes. Now, while the Showa-era riders did start to become younger, most notably with Kotaro Minami's actor Tetsuo Kurata being 20 at the time, it was clear that from the beginning of the Heisei era to even now, they're definitely going more for the... "Oh no, he's hot!" The fact that they had lowered the average age to early instead of late 20s meant now we were dealing with men freshly out of college and often job hunting. These shows were no longer all that concerned about maintaining independence from organizations that look vaguely familiar. You could say this was a reflection of the fact that Japan was in a much more comfortable spot. They had all but recovered from both the war and their economy collapsing, giving the riders the ability to ease up and even become a little bit more like their tokusatsu brethren. Not that much like them. But yeah, while they still occasionally fought authority figures like big businesses and even the police, for the most part, Heisei and Reiwa-era riders are trying to appeal more to a younger, innocent boy audience while still teaching them how to get ready for the harshness that laid ahead. And oh boy, did get harsh at times. While the settings and tone had overall lightened up for the Kamen Rider franchise, a certain theme from the Showa era had remained, and in fact, might have been even intensified as the shows became more character-focused. That being, the idea that being a superhero kind of sucked, and yet they still had to try and remain good people. The ideals of just being a good person were given heavier emphasis during Heisei and into Reiwa, but while they may sound easy on paper, the fact is it often isn't, especially when it comes to these characters. On top of their conflicts becoming progressively more strenuous on their physical and mental capabilities, they also had to deal with the possibility that they could become just like what they were fighting against. As I said earlier, riders often derive their powers from the same source as their antagonists, and in some cases, they even risk the possibility of literally becoming their enemy. Thus, they would more than likely have to sacrifice a part of themselves just to remain prominent fixtures of goodwill and hope for their audiences, be it their own health, friends, or even their very humanity. It kind of all ties back to Skullman, though he pretty much started off as a monster, purely being driven by his own vendetta. With that, if I were to sum up what I think makes for a good lead rider, I think these are some of their core tenets across all the eras. 1. They do need to have a good degree of independence. While this idea has somewhat faded since the times of Showa, the newer riders still do try to resolve conflicts with the least number of casualties. Which leads into my next tenet, that they should have the resolve to sacrifice a part of themselves for the greater good. Due to often using similar powers as their enemy, they always are at risk of becoming the very thing they're fighting against, and thus should be prepared to make the necessary sacrifices. And last, and most importantly, they do need to be a good person. Again, as simple as that may sound, the writers will often face challenges that will question the morality as to what even is the righteous path. Ultimately though, these characters will choose the path that saves the most lives as they try to maintain their own personal morals of being good people who can encourage others, like their target audience of young boys, to better themselves as they enter into adulthood. And while they might not always be able to maintain that stance all the way until the end, they will find a way to stand up again because they are the heroes who are willing to pay the price of heroism.
誰かの力になれたら心の底から嬉しくなってやりを期待したらそれは正義とは言わないぞ。
Honestly, it's no wonder James Gunn thinks that there's an audience for Kamen Rider in the West. I mean, I would never trust Hollywood to make a proper adaptation, but still, the sentiment is nice. With the general basis for the Kamen Rider set, let's move on to the Super Sentai and their leads, who are a little hard to pin down. I mean, putting aside the whole white versus red debate, the lead characters of these shows sometimes are not even the actual leaders of these teams. They're still considered the leads if they get the lion's share of focus, so that'll be our main deciding criteria for them. Though with that in mind, what do these characters do to earn that attention? Well, once again, let's consider the history of this particular franchise. The initial Sentai teams did fight against similar adversaries that I can't talk about on the stupid site. Let me guess, you and the Great Leo Shocker get along really well with Dr. Hell and his goons. But yeah, as a result of Shotaro Ishinomori having creative influence over the first two series, Go Ranger and Jacker were a little more on the writer side in terms of tone and themes, until he was booed off of the franchise due to Jacker's failing ratings and toy sales as we've previously covered. In that same video, we also mentioned how Jacker and Go Ranger were only retroactively made a part of the same franchise, so yeah, in many ways you could say, unlike the writers, Super Sentai had no real basis to build off of initially. Thus, I would say the Showa era Sentai leads in general lacked any distinct identities as their franchise was still developing, giving us a lot of milquetoast leads who were just kind of bland leaders and Boy Scouts. Certainly not objectively bad traits for a hero, but also not giving us a lot to actually analyze. Thankfully, once we entered into Heisei, things start to pick up. Yes, there was still a bit of an odd mixture of great to not so great leads, but they did at least start to develop personalities, which is kind of key to truly connecting with an audience. Now, I'm not even going to try to pin down an average age for these characters to figure out this franchise's audience, as there's way too much variance between the different series and even in the teams on their own. That said, the audience for Super Sentai has always been kind of clear: young boys or older men who buy the toys. Why are you coming back to me? Though with that in mind, it does kind of go to show how this franchise has been able to reach the widest audience amongst the Trinity. I mean, not only has it broken the gender barrier and somewhat spawned the habits of another franchise that we'll get into in just a bit, but they've also broken many cultural barriers. Several Sentai cast members were born outside of the country, and more recently, a great character like Commander Hilltop from Lupat got some decent representation without falling back on stereotypes. You know, just putting aside some of the Eddie Murphy jokes. The point is, there's good reason why this franchise has been the only one so far to find international success. Part of this might be because, as we've previously pointed out, their third series, Battle Fever J, was a joint venture with Marvel, and there were plans of making it a part of their multiverse. Still, even though that thankfully didn't come to pass, you could argue that Stan Lee's influence still remains amongst all of these franchises to this day. You know, more so than modern Marvel at least. The concepts of many of these series aren't often just flexible enough that Power Rangers can create their own unique stories and leads even while using the same stock footage. And when they stick too closely to the original, they often end up failing. And maybe that's the best way to look at this franchise's major themes and leads. They're all about freedom of expression. Even when their shows are thematically and or tonally different, the Sentai leads often try to encourage their teammates to be the very best they can be, like any good leader would. As a result, they do tend to go either of two ways. You either get a bit of a bland leader with much more interesting teammates, which I think was the case for many of the Showa Sentai, or a Gary Stu, who ends up becoming the most influential person on everyone else's lives, instead of being a total putz who also hoards all the power-ups for themselves. Thus, obviously, the best kind of leads are the ones in the middle, the ones who can influence the best attributes out of their teammates without stealing too much of their thunder in the process. It also helps if they have their own unique charisma and are entertaining without becoming total clowns. Everything else about them can be free range, be it their age, occupation, or even suit color, as long as they have an open mind towards fostering the best not just in their team, but also the world around them. While Shotaro Ishinomori originally envisioned Go Ranger as just another Kamen Rider entry, the Super Sentai franchise truly has become its own unique entity that, just like its much larger cast, can take on many different faces. Last and certainly not least, considering what this channel is mainly about, let's talk the Precure. As stated in the very first Toei Trinity video, this franchise has had many different influences between its company brethren and brothers from a different mother. And while the target demographic has and always will be little girls, Toei has made it the clearest that they know about the big friends, aka us. But yeah, while having somewhat of a flexible audience, like Kamen Rider, this franchise ultimately targets a specific demographic, which is best reflected in the fact that all of their leads are pretty much the same age of 13 to 14, and until this year were even all the same color. Though obviously at that age, they're not doing stories about job hunting schmoes, but rather another very important impasse in anyone's life, the coming of age story. Now of course, there's a lot of room for debate on how a writer should approach this narrative. The roots of it could be traced back to a story genre established in Germany called Bildungsroman, or commonly translated, the formation novel. And many scholars can't even really agree on how to even interpret the translation of that term, but I do think Kenneth Miller brought up some good points, like how the narrative should take into consideration the social obligations and expectations commonly associated with the time and place the characters live in, which has kind of been what we've been doing throughout this whole video with the whole audience thing. And while technically all members of every team went through those sorts of stories, regardless of age or even species, the lead here, of course, had to remain the representative of the widest audience possible. This also conveniently gave the initial creators of this franchise, who were a bunch of dudes who didn't know much about magical girls, the ability to make things a little more accessible to everyone. The story arcs of many lead cures could apply to just about anyone, hence why I think this franchise has had such a strong staying power, and as I said, could even promote bringing in writers from the Tokusatsu division who have acted as very important pitch hitters. Because of that, I think they ended up adopting some of the best aspects of both the writers and the Sentai. While the lead cures can and should be leaders who try to bring out the best in their team like the Sentai, they should also try to find some degree of independence if they expect to complete their little coming-of-age stories. Hell, let's not forget, some of the first series didn't really have leaders. You could argue that was kind of the case for Maxar, but not so much for the duels, but I digress. The point is that while I do argue that the lead cures shouldn't steal all of the spotlight, especially if it leaves much of their team underdeveloped, their story should be a focal point to the show's major themes and plot. To accomplish this, I think more so than at least some of the Sentai leads, they should go through a significant amount of self-reflection. After all, 13 to 14 are arguably the most difficult points in anyone's life, especially kids in Japan. To say that this traditionalist country places heavy expectations on the next generation is a massive understatement. And while this franchise understandably held back on some of its punches, they certainly didn't hold back on some of their right hooks, which honestly, that was probably for the best. The self-reflecting moments for the Cures are probably the greatest examples of this, as many ultimately acknowledge one very important fact. Pain and suffering are inevitabilities. Yeah, ironically, the franchise that's arguably made for a much younger and perceivably more innocent audience ended up hitting some of the same notes as the Kamen Riders, with characters who need to sacrifice a part of themselves for the greater good. Though while many of the writers suggest just kind of sucking it up and pushing through, the lead Cures often end up actually exploring these themes a lot more. This will also often lead to the antagonists poking some very plausible holes in their philosophies. From there, the real challenge becomes how well they can support their side of the argument and prove that they're not just spouting empty platitudes. As a result, the Cures end up telling much more personal tales and do find ways of minimizing the sacrifice, giving them much more hopeful resolutions, especially compared to some of the Riders. Now, of course, I don't think this in any way makes them better or worse than the Bug Warriors. It's a definite case of apples and oranges. In the end, outliers aside, the Precure's audience are young to adolescent girls who are being given heavy reality checks of what to expect come adulthood. As such, while lead Cures should do everything to be good leaders who can foster the development of their teams to a degree, they should also show a degree of being able to stand on their own. Accepting all of the difficulties that life ends up throwing at you isn't always easy, but you know, sometimes it's just a part of growing up.
そうやって悩むから苦しむから人は強くなれるんだと思う
Okay, so originally this was going to be an all-in-one video, but then I realized this has been going on for a little long, plus the next part is going to be really long. So for your sanity and mine, let's split this up into two. Still, do come back next time, as we'll try to find the best lead character representations of each of these franchises. We'll go through some honorable mentions, and hopefully get a new appreciation for some of these great characters in the process. Look forward to it coming out, hopefully very soon, and until then though, farewell for now, my friends.